Sometimes, the cold doesn't just take your warmth. Sometimes, it takes the last place in the world that still remembers your name. By the time the snow began swallowing the highway outside Black Hollow Ridge, Ethan Calloway had already learned what it felt like to disappear. The motel manager never looked him in the eyes when he handed over the final warning. Maybe shame worked that way. Maybe people found it easier to throw away broken things when they stopped pretending they had feelings. The neon vacancy sign buzzed weakly behind them, flickering red against the growing storm as Ethan stood beneath the awning with one duffel bag slung over his shoulder and his German shepherd sitting quietly at his side like he had seen this kind of ending before. "I gave you 3 extra weeks," the manager muttered, stuffing his hands into the pockets of a grease-stained coat. "Can't keep losing money, man. Snowstorm's bringing in tourists." Ethan nodded once. No argument. No anger. After enough years, pride became expensive, and cold had a way of humbling everyone eventually. Ranger pressed his broad shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg. 6 years old, silver gray and cream-colored, ears sharp against the wind, amber eyes studying the man who had once trusted explosions more than silence. The dog never barked unless something mattered. That was military training. Or instinct. Ethan still wasn't sure. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, resting a gloved hand against Ranger's neck. The shepherd exhaled slowly, warm breath rising like smoke into the November air. The parking lot stretched empty except for Ethan's aging pickup truck parked near the edge beneath a dead pine tree bent sideways from too many winters. The truck rattled when it started, coughing like an old soldier refusing retirement. Inside, the heater barely worked, blowing weak air that smelled faintly of rust and pine cleaner. Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror without really looking at himself. 40 years old, former Navy SEAL, broad shoulders still carrying traces of discipline even after years of drifting. Dark brown hair streaked lightly with silver above his temples. Steel blue eyes dulled by too many nights spent sleeping where the world forgot to look. The beard had grown uneven lately. He stopped caring sometime last spring. Outside, snow thickened against the windshield. Heavy flakes moved sideways in the rising wind, swallowing road signs one at a time like secrets being erased. Black Hollow Ridge wasn't much of a town to begin with. One gas station, one diner, one hardware store that somehow survived every winter despite looking permanently closed. Ethan had stayed because cheap motels asked fewer questions. But now even that door had closed. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears forward, body stiff. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. The dog's gaze fixed somewhere beyond the highway, toward the dark outline of the mountains rising west of town. Ranger's nose twitched once. Then again. Not nervous. Focused. Listening. Ethan followed his stare, but saw nothing except snow rolling through the pines. "Nothing out there but frozen rock," he muttered. Ranger did not move. A low sound rumbled softly in his chest. Not a growl. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. Ethan had heard that sound overseas only a handful of times. Once before a mudslide buried half a village. Another time minutes before hidden explosives were found beneath a collapsed road. Ranger sensed patterns humans ignored. Ethan had stopped doubting him years ago. "All right," he sighed. "We'll head west. Find somewhere to wait this thing out." The highway narrowed fast once they left town. Snow drifted higher across the pavement, piling against guardrails in ghostly shapes. Wind clawed through the mountain pass hard enough to shake the truck. Visibility dropped to barely 30 feet. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes locked ahead, unusually alert. Mile after mile passed in silence, except for the groan of the engine and the whisper of tires struggling through ice. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had survived war zones, storms at sea, nights where breathing too loudly could cost lives. But winter carried its own kind of danger. Quiet. Patient, indifferent, the kind that waited for exhaustion to make decisions for you. Then came the sound, a sharp metallic cough beneath the hood. The truck jerked once, twice. Ethan frowned. "Come on," he muttered. Another sputter, then silence. The steering wheel stiffened as momentum carried them toward the shoulder. Snow slammed against the windows. The truck rolled to a stop beside a wall of pine trees already disappearing beneath white. For a moment, everything went still except the storm. Ethan turned the key once. Nothing. Twice. Nothing again. He leaned back slowly, staring through the windshield at the road vanishing into darkness. Cell service gone. Nearest town at least 20 miles back. Temperature already dropping fast enough to turn dangerous after sunset. He let out a long breath and rubbed tired fingers over his face. Guess we're walking, huh? Ranger stood immediately. Not anxious. Ready. But then something strange happened. Instead of waiting at the truck door, the shepherd turned sharply toward the woods. Ears raised. Tail low. Watching something Ethan could not yet see. Snow swirled through the trees in silver waves as Ranger gave one short bark and stepped forward into the storm like he already knew where hope was hiding. Ranger moved through the snow with a certainty that unsettled Ethan more than the storm itself. The shepherd did not hesitate, did not glance back for reassurance the way most dogs would. He simply walked into the white wilderness, nose low, ears alert, as though some invisible thread pulled him forward through the dark. Ethan zipped his weathered military jacket higher against the cold and grabbed the flashlight from his duffel bag. The beam barely reached 20 feet before snow swallowed the light whole. Wind pushed hard against the trees, bending pine branches until they groaned like old wood settling into memory. You better know something I do not, buddy, Ethan muttered, pulling the truck door shut behind him. Ranger stopped for just a second, looking back over his shoulder. His amber eyes caught the flashlight beam, bright and steady, before he turned again and continued deeper between the pines. Ethan followed. Boots sank nearly 8 inches into fresh snow with every step. The cold moved differently out here. In town, winter felt annoying. Out here, it felt personal, sharp, ancient, like something alive had wrapped cold fingers around the mountain and decided no one crossed without permission. The storm thickened fast. Within minutes, the road behind them had vanished entirely beneath blowing white. Ethan glanced back once and realized he could no longer see the outline of his truck. Just darkness and snow. He had spent enough years surviving impossible situations to understand what that meant. Going back was no longer safer than moving forward. Ranger slowed near a cluster of broken pines, nose twitching toward the wind. Then he veered left suddenly, climbing higher across a narrow ridge hidden beneath drifts. Ethan nearly slipped twice, keeping pace. Easy, he called softly, breath clouding the air. You trying to kill an old man? Ranger ignored him. Somewhere in the distance came the low crack of shifting ice or falling timber. Hard to tell in weather like this. Every sound stretched strangely in snowstorms, swallowed and reshaped until mountains seemed to whisper things nobody wanted to hear. Ethan had always hated silence after the military. Back then, silence usually meant danger had not happened yet. His lungs burned by the time they reached a shallow rise overlooking the valley below. Snow swept sideways in ghostly curtains. Ranger froze, completely still. Ethan stopped too. The shepherd stood rigid, head tilted slightly towards something buried inside the storm. One paw lifted, listening. Ethan followed his gaze and almost missed it. Far ahead through the trees, maybe 100 yards downhill, something interrupted the endless white. A shape, dark against snow, too square to be rock, too still to be shadow. Ethan narrowed his eyes. No way, he whispered. Ranger gave one short bark and started downhill immediately. Hope felt dangerous. Ethan knew that better than most. Hope got people hurt sometimes, but freezing to death got people nowhere. They moved carefully through thick drifts until the shape emerged clearer between the pines. A structure, small, weathered, half buried beneath snow as though the mountain itself had spent years trying to forget it existed. The roof slanted sharply beneath heavy ice. Stone walls stood dark against the storm. A chimney rose crookedly into the sky, black with age. Ranger quickened his pace. Ethan slowed. Something about the place felt wrong. Or maybe too quiet. No tire tracks. No footprints. No light in the windows. Just stillness heavy enough to feel deliberate. Like the cabin had been waiting longer than anyone intended. The front porch leaned slightly beneath layers of snow. A rusted lantern hung beside the door, moving gently in the wind, though Ethan could swear there was almost no breeze down here anymore. Ranger climbed the wooden steps without hesitation and stopped at the entrance. Then something strange happened. The dog pressed his nose against the weathered wood and gave 2 slow taps of his paw. Not scratching. Tapping. Intentional. Ethan frowned. What are you hearing? Ranger glanced toward the side of the cabin, ears flicking once toward the ground itself. Ethan had seen that look before overseas. Underground vibrations. Hidden movement. Something beneath. He stepped closer and brushed snow away from the front window with his glove. Darkness inside. But not complete darkness. Something faint flickered deeper in the room. Warm-colored. Gold against shadow. His chest tightened. Firelight. Impossible. Hello, he called, voice rough against the wind. Nothing answered. Just the quiet creak of snow settling on pine branches. Ranger sat near the door, but did not relax. Alert. Waiting. Ethan reached for the rusted handle carefully. Locked. He tried again. Stuck from years of cold maybe. Or abandonment. He looked toward the nearest window. Curtains hung inside. Faded green. Strangely untouched by dust. Then he noticed it. Smoke. Barely visible against the storm. Rising in thin gray threads from the crooked chimney overhead. His pulse slowed for the first time in hours. Somebody had to be here. Or had been. Well, he whispered softly, staring into the storm around them. Looks like the mountain forgot to mention we were not alone. And if you are enjoying this story so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the best journeys begin exactly where hope almost disappears. Ranger suddenly stood, ears raised high, body tense again. Then, from somewhere deep inside the cabin, came a sound so faint Ethan almost thought the wind imagined it for him. 3 soft metallic chimes. Slow, gentle, like something inside had just awakened. The sound came again. 3 soft metallic chimes drifting through the cabin like distant echoes caught between memory and wind. Ethan stood frozen on the porch, snow gathering along the shoulders of his jacket, while Ranger stared at the door as though waiting for permission from something unseen. The mountain had gone strangely quiet around them. No snapping branches. No howling gusts tearing through the trees. Even the storm seemed to pause for a breath, as if listening. Ethan swallowed slowly and tried the handle again. This time it turned. The old wood groaned inward with the sound of hinges that had not moved in years. Warmth met him first. Not much, but enough to feel impossible. Enough to make his skin sting after the cold. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke, old paper, and something deeper beneath it all, something metallic and clean like old machinery left resting too long. Ranger stepped inside before Ethan did, paused silent against worn wooden floorboards. His nose moved carefully through the air. Not nervous. Focused. Working. Ethan followed, easing the door shut behind them as snow rattled softly against the windows. The room was small, but surprisingly intact. A stone fireplace glowed low against one wall, embers breathing orange beneath stacked logs. Nearby sat an iron kettle releasing slow curls of steam. Not abandoned then. Somebody had been here recently. Yet the place felt untouched in a way Ethan could not explain. Like a memory preserved too carefully. Shelves lined the walls filled with old books, lanterns, weathered maps, and military keepsakes dulled by time. A brass compass rested beside a folded American flag inside a dusty shadow box. On the far side of the room stood a heavy oak table with 2 empty mugs already placed near the edge, as if someone once expected company and never stopped expecting it. Ethan moved cautiously, instincts sharper now. Hello, he called again, voice steady but respectful. Anybody here? Nothing answered except the soft crackle of fire. Ranger wandered toward the fireplace, then stopped suddenly. His ears lifted high. A low sound rolled quietly in his chest. Not fear. Recognition again. Ethan noticed the dog staring toward a narrow hallway disappearing into shadow. The shepherd remained completely still, watching, listening. Ethan followed his gaze. You hearing somebody? Ranger did not move. Then came another sound. Slow footsteps overhead. Ethan's pulse tightened immediately. One step, then another. Deliberate. Measured. Not threatening, but real. He straightened instinctively. Years of training settling back into his muscles before thought could catch up. Snow melted slowly from his boots onto the old floorboards. I do not mean any trouble, he called toward the ceiling. Silence answered. Then, after several seconds, a voice drifted softly through the cabin. Old, gravelly, calm. Funny thing about storms, the voice said. They always seem to bring exactly who they are supposed to. Ethan frowned. Ranger relaxed slightly, tail lowering. Not alarmed anymore. The stairway creaked near the back corner of the room. A figure slowly descended from above, carrying an old lantern in one weathered hand. He looked somewhere in his late 70s, tall but thin beneath a thick wool sweater darkened with age. Silver hair tied loosely at the back of his neck. A beard white as frost framed a narrow face lined by decades of mountain winters. But it was the man's eyes that caught Ethan off guard. Sharp blue. Steady. The kind of eyes belonging to somebody who had watched storms longer than fear itself. "You can put your shoulders down, son," the old man said gently. "If I wanted trouble, I would not have left soup warming." Ethan exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. The old man glanced toward Ranger and gave the smallest smile. "Now him," he said quietly. "I figured would show up eventually." Ethan blinked once. "You know my dog?" The old man chuckled softly, moving toward the fireplace with careful steps. "No," he said. "But dogs like him do not wander into mountains by accident." Ranger approached the stranger slowly. No barking, no hesitation, just quiet inspection. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the shepherd sat beside the old man and rested briefly against his leg. Approval. Immediate. Ethan trusted few things these days. Ranger's instincts were one of them. "Name is Walter Vale," the old man said, extending a rough hand. "Been living up here long enough for the mountain to stop arguing with me." Ethan shook it cautiously. "Ethan Calloway." Walter nodded once, gaze lingering briefly on Ethan's posture, the old military watch at his wrist, the careful way he scanned exits without thinking. "Military," he said simply. Ethan gave a small nod. "Navy." Walter looked unsurprised. "Figured." He turned toward the stove and lifted the kettle carefully. "Storm like this can kill a man before sunrise. Sit down before pride makes poor decisions." Ethan hesitated. Something still felt strange. Too convenient. Too quiet. The fire already burning. The tea still warm. 2 mugs waiting on the table. As if somebody had known. Ranger suddenly stood again and padded toward the far wall near the fireplace. He sniffed once, then twice, then pressed one paw lightly against the wooden floor. Ethan noticed immediately. The same signal. Focused. Deliberate. Something underneath. Ranger kept his paw pressed lightly against the floorboards, amber eyes fixed on the same spot as though the old would carried a secret only he could hear. The fire crackled softly behind them, casting warm gold across the room, but something colder lingered beneath the cabin. Ethan felt it now. Not fear exactly. Awareness. The kind that settled quietly into a soldier's instincts before answers arrived. Walter followed Ethan's gaze and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Seems he found it quicker than most," the old man murmured. Ethan looked over. "Found what?" Walter lowered himself carefully into a weathered chair near the fireplace, joints stiff from years spent fighting mountain winters. Outside, snow whispered against the cabin windows like distant voices brushing past the glass. "This place," Walter said quietly, staring into the flames, "has a habit of choosing strange timing." Ethan frowned slightly. "That does not explain why my dog is acting like there is somebody buried under your floor." The old man chuckled softly at that, though there was something thoughtful in his expression now. Not surprise. Recognition. Ranger tapped the wood again. Once. Then twice. Deliberate. Ethan crouched beside him and pressed his palm against the floorboards. Cold at first. Then something else. Faint. Barely noticeable. A vibration. Rhythmic. Soft enough to doubt if he had not spent years trained to notice impossible things. His hand stilled. There it was again. A low pulse moving somewhere beneath the cabin. Not mechanical exactly, but structured. Deliberate. Ranger whined quietly, ears flicking toward Ethan before returning to the floor. "You feel that?" Ethan asked. Walter nodded once without looking surprised. "Every 27 seconds, he said calmly. "Been happening near 15 years now." Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately. 27 seconds. The number struck something old in his memory. Search patterns. Rescue timing. Underground stabilization systems. Navy operations used intervals like that for equipment checks in collapsed environments. Too precise to ignore. Too regular to dismiss. "You never checked?" Ethan asked. Walter smiled faintly into the fire. "Mountain people learn not to disturb things unless they ask to be disturbed first." Ethan stood slowly, gaze moving around the room again. Suddenly details he had overlooked began stitching themselves together. Military memorabilia placed carefully on shelves. A heavy steel flashlight resting near the stove. Old photographs framed along the wall. Men in uniforms. Snow-covered ridges. Rescue dogs. One picture caught his attention. A younger Walter standing beside two soldiers outside what looked like an underground facility somewhere deep in the mountains. Ranger left the floor suddenly and padded toward a narrow hallway, disappearing deeper into the cabin. He stopped halfway down and looked back once, waiting. Ethan knew that look. "Follow me." "He always this stubborn?" Walter asked with quiet amusement. Ethan grabbed his gloves. "Only when he is right." Walter sighed softly and reached for the lantern beside his chair. "Guess tonight is finally the night, then." Ethan paused. "Night for what?" The old man stood slowly and motioned toward the hallway. "For someone besides me to see what this mountain has been protecting." The hallway narrowed as they walked, walls lined with old cedar planks darkened by age and smoke. Lantern light danced softly across faded photographs pinned unevenly to the wood. Soldiers smiling beside snowmobiles. Search teams. Mountain rescues. Faces weathered by hard winters and harder years. Ranger moved ahead with growing focus, stopping at the very end of the hall near a heavy iron stove bolted against the wall. Then he barked once. Sharp. Certain. Ethan stepped closer. Nothing unusual at first glance. Just worn floorboards and an old rug curled slightly at the edges. But Ranger nudged the rug aside with his nose. Beneath it sat a steel ring fixed into the floor. Ethan looked toward Walter slowly. "You have got to be kidding me." Walter only shrugged. "Been waiting a long time to see who would finally open it." Ethan crouched and wrapped gloved fingers around the metal handle. Heavy. Cold. He pulled once. Nothing moved. Walter stepped beside him and pointed near the edge. "Pressure lock," he said quietly. "Old military engineering. Try shifting left first." Ethan followed the instruction. The mechanism released with a low metallic click buried deep beneath the floor. Ranger stepped backward immediately, ears raised high now. Waiting. Ethan pulled harder. Slowly, the hatch lifted. A rush of colder air climbed upward from below, carrying the faint smell of stone, steel, and something impossibly familiar. Clean fuel. Stored supplies. Underground air circulation. Lantern lights spilled downward onto narrow metal steps, disappearing into darkness beneath the cabin. Ethan stared in silence. Somewhere below, something hummed softly. Not broken. Alive. Walter rested one weathered hand against the doorframe and looked down with an expression somewhere between memory and grief. "Funny thing about storms," he said quietly. "Sometimes they do not trap people." He looked toward Ethan then, something heavier settling behind his pale blue eyes. "Sometimes," he said softly, "they bring people home before they even know they are lost." The stairwell disappeared into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow the lantern light before it could settle. Ethan stood at the edge of the open hatch for several quiet seconds, staring downward while cold air drifted upward in slow breaths, carrying the faint scent of steel, stone, and something strangely familiar. Clean storage. Filtered ventilation. Discipline. The kind of order military minds left behind when they still believed survival depended on preparation. Ranger moved first. The shepherd stepped cautiously toward the opening, ears upright, nose testing the air with patient focus. No fear. No hesitation. Just certainty. Ethan trusted that more than instinct sometimes. "You sure this is safe?" he asked quietly, glancing toward Walter. The old man adjusted the lantern in his weathered hands and offered a tired smile that seemed older than the mountain around them. "Safe enough," he said softly. "Depends on what memories you are carrying down there with you." Ethan frowned slightly at that, but said nothing. Ranger had already started descending, one paw at a time. Careful, purposeful. Ethan followed, gripping the cold metal railing bolted into stone. The stairs spiraled deeper than expected, maybe 20 feet below the cabin before finally leveling out into a narrow corridor reinforced with steel beams darkened by age. Soft amber lights lined the walls overhead. Dim, but working. Somehow still working. Ethan slowed. No way this place still has power. Walter's voice echoed gently behind him. Solar batteries. Backup generators. Water filtration. Somebody built this place to outlast storms. Ranger paused halfway down the corridor and glanced back, waiting again. The air below felt different. Warmer than outside, but still carrying a strange stillness. Not empty. Preserved. Like stepping into a room someone had just left for lunch years ago and somehow never returned. The corridor opened suddenly into a larger underground chamber, and Ethan stopped moving altogether. His breath caught before he even realized it had. The space stretched wider than the cabin above by 3 times at least. Shelving lined the walls stacked with carefully labeled supplies. Blankets folded perfectly. Medical kits. Canned food sorted by year. Flashlights arranged beside radios still plugged into charging stations. Maps pinned carefully beneath glass cases. Military insignias mounted beside old rescue photographs. Along one side stood 6 neatly made bunk beds, untouched beneath wool blankets folded with impossible precision. The kind of precision only military people understood. Jesus, Ethan whispered under his breath. Ranger moved slowly across the room, paws soft against polished concrete, stopping occasionally to sniff corners as though confirming what he already knew. Walter lowered the lantern near a long wooden work table in the center of the room. Told you, he said quietly. Storms bring strange things. Ethan turned slowly in place. Who built all this? Walter rested one hand against the back of a chair worn smooth with age. For a moment, the old man did not answer. His eyes drifted toward the far wall where framed photographs stood lined in careful rows. Men in winter gear. Search dogs. Mountain rescues. Helicopters dusted with snow. Smiling faces carrying the quiet kind of exhaustion earned by helping strangers survive impossible nights. Then Ethan noticed something else. A plaque mounted above them. Brass lettering dim beneath time. North Ridge, transitional shelter for returning service members. Ethan stepped closer without meaning to. His chest tightened strangely. Returning service members? He asked quietly. Walter nodded once. Veterans, he said. Mostly the ones nobody remembered how to help anymore. Ranger stopped near a steel cabinet and looked back toward Ethan. Waiting. Ethan barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the photographs. Young faces. Older faces. Some smiling. Some carrying the distant look he knew too well. Men and women who had come home physically alive, but somehow left pieces of themselves elsewhere. Who ran this place? Ethan asked after a moment. Walter exhaled slowly and walked toward the photographs. He stopped near one frame in particular. A tall man in military winter gear, standing beside a German shepherd outside a mountain rescue shelter. Broad shoulders. Calm eyes. Strong jaw softened by age. Something familiar sat inside his posture. Ethan could not explain it. Walter touched the frame gently. Dr. Benjamin Mercer, he said quietly. Former combat medic. Spent years helping soldiers overseas. Came home and realized nobody knew what to do with the ones still carrying storms inside. Ethan said nothing. Something about the name stirred faintly somewhere in memory. Walter continued softly. He built this place after losing too many friends who came home feeling forgotten. Said mountains understood lonely people better than cities did. Ranger barked once near the steel cabinet. Short. Certain. Ethan finally looked over. The shepherd had nudged something loose. A folder rested half open on the floor beside him. Ethan crouched and picked it up slowly. Thick. Weathered. Military records. Handwritten notes. Names. Arrival dates. Supply lists. Then one page slipped free. Ethan froze. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. The handwriting was old but steady. Across the top read one sentence written in dark ink. For those still trying to find their way home. Beneath it sat a list of names. Veterans who had stayed here over the years. Ethan's eyes moved slowly down the page, then stopped completely. His pulse shifted hard against his ribs. One name near the bottom stood underlined. Commander Nathan Calloway. Ethan stared silently. His older brother. Missing for nearly 8 years. Ethan did not move for several seconds. The underground room around him seemed to quiet in strange sympathy, the faint hum of ventilation softening into something distant and unreal. Commander Nathan Calloway. His brother's name sat on the paper like a voice reaching across years Ethan had spent trying not to remember too much. Ranger stepped closer and sat beside him, shoulder pressing lightly against Ethan's knee with the same steady patience he always offered when silence became heavier than words. Ethan lowered himself onto the edge of a nearby chair without realizing he had done it. His gloved hand tightened around the folder. That is not possible, he said quietly, though the words sounded uncertain even to him. Walter remained near the photographs, hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked neither surprised nor confused. only tired in the way old men looked when life repeated patterns they already understood. You knew him? Ethan finally asked. Walter nodded once. Nathan stayed here nearly 6 winters ago, he said softly. Only meant to stay a week. Stayed almost 6 months. Ethan looked up sharply. 6 months. Walter moved toward the work table and carefully lowered himself into the chair across from Ethan. The lantern between them cast warm gold against the old man's weathered face, deepening every line carved there by mountain weather and memory. He came in during another storm, Walter said quietly. Middle of January. Colder than this one if you can believe it. Snow had blocked every road for days. Dog found him too. Ethan blinked once. Dog. Walter nodded toward a framed photograph near the wall. Ethan stood and crossed the room slowly. There beside Nathan stood a German shepherd darker than Ranger, older around the muzzle, but carrying the same sharp military focus in his posture. Nathan's arm rested lightly around the dog's shoulders. He was smiling, really smiling. Ethan had almost forgotten his brother looked like that once. His name was Atlas, Walter said gently behind him. Retired search dog. Smart as they come. Ranger reminds me of him. Ethan swallowed hard. His older brother had disappeared 8 years ago. No goodbye, no warning. Just silence after years of service and too many losses nobody in the family ever talked about properly. Authorities called it voluntary disappearance. Ethan called it heartbreak wearing camouflage. Their mother had spent 3 years waiting beside the phone before grief finally taught her patience had limits. Why did he leave? Ethan asked quietly. Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood and moved toward a nearby cabinet. He opened the door carefully and removed an old leather journal worn smooth around the edges. Truth is, Walter said softly, setting it on the table, he never really stopped looking for home. He just stopped believing people knew where it was. Ethan looked down at the journal. Nathan's handwriting stretched neatly across the cover. Property log and recovery notes. Familiar enough to make Ethan's chest ache unexpectedly. Ranger rested near Ethan's boots now, calm but watchful, amber eyes drifting occasionally toward the steel hallway, as though still listening to something beneath the mountain itself. Walter opened the journal carefully. Folded notes rested between pages. Maps. Weather records. Handwritten reflections written late at night by the look of the uneven penmanship. Ethan hesitated before turning one page. The date caught him immediately. November. 8 years ago. Nathan's words settled heavily against the quiet room. First time sleeping through the night in years. Strange what mountains do to a man. They do not ask questions. They just sit with you until silence stops feeling dangerous. Ethan looked away briefly. His brother had never spoken much after deployment. Even family dinners felt careful around him, like everyone feared saying the wrong thing would break something already cracked. Walter watched him quietly. Nathan carried storms inside, he said gently. But he still looked out for people. Helped repair generators. Fixed water lines. Took rescue calls when hikers got lost. Ethan turned another page slowly. A photograph slipped free and landed softly against the table. Nathan standing beside Walter outside the cabin above, snow falling around them, while Atlas sat proudly between them. On the back someone had written in faded ink. Some shelters save lives. Others remind you why living matters. Ethan stared at the handwriting longer than he meant to. His throat tightened unexpectedly. What happened to him? He asked finally, voice lower now. Walter exhaled slowly, gaze drifting toward the ceiling above where storm winds whispered faintly through old beams. He left one spring morning, the old man said softly. Said he needed to finish something. Ethan frowned. Finish what? Walter looked toward the far end of the underground room where a narrow hallway disappeared behind another steel door. He never said directly, Walter replied. But before he left, he sealed part of this place and told me something strange. Ethan looked up again. Walter's pale blue eyes softened with memory. He said one day, the old man murmured, another Callaway would arrive during a storm. Said if a shepherd led him here, it meant the mountain finally decided he was ready. Ranger lifted his head immediately at the word shepherd. Then slowly, deliberately, the dog stood and turned toward the sealed steel door at the far end of the shelter. One short bark echoed softly underground. Then another. Waiting. Ranger barked again, softer this time, but no less certain. The sound drifted through the underground shelter and settled against the steel door at the far end of the hallway, as though something behind it had been waiting longer than anyone realized. Ethan stood slowly, Nathan's journal still resting in one hand while old questions moved heavily through his chest, like whether trying to decide whether to break. 8 years. 8 years of silence. 8 years of wondering whether his older brother had disappeared because he wanted freedom or because something inside him had finally collapsed beneath too much weight. Walter watched quietly from across the room, his weathered expression carrying the kind of patience older people learned after enough grief stopped surprising them. He always trusted dogs more than maps, Walter said softly. Said they listened to things people forgot how to hear. Ethan looked toward Ranger, standing perfectly still near the steel door. Ears raised, tail low, waiting. You know what is behind there? Ethan asked. Walter hesitated. For the first time all night, uncertainty crossed the old man's face. No, he admitted quietly. Nathan sealed it before he left. Said some doors only open when the right storm arrives. Ethan let out a tired breath through his nose. That sounds exactly like something he would say after too much coffee and not enough sleep. A faint smile touched Walter's face. Then maybe you already know more than you think. Outside somewhere above them, the mountain groaned beneath shifting snow. A distant vibration rolled softly through the shelter walls. Ranger turned briefly toward the ceiling, ears flicking once, before focusing again on the steel door. Ethan stepped closer. The door looked older than everything else underground. Reinforced steel scratched by time, fitted tightly into concrete walls as though built to withstand more than winter. A faded military keypad rested beside it, long dark except for one tiny green light still blinking steadily. Alive after all these years. Ethan frowned. How is this still working? Walter shrugged lightly. Nathan rebuilt most of the electrical systems before leaving. Said some things mattered enough to keep breathing. Ethan stared at the keypad. Something about it felt strangely familiar. Then memory surfaced quietly. Nathan standing in their father's garage years ago, teaching Ethan old lock systems after school. You always leave one way back in, little brother. In case somebody gets lost. Ethan reached toward the keypad almost without thinking. Ranger moved closer immediately, pressing lightly against his side. Warm. Steady. Grounding. Ethan looked down briefly. You think he brought us here for a reason? Ranger blinked once, calm and patient in the way only dogs could manage when humans complicated simple truths. Walter stepped closer. Nathan talked about you sometimes, he said softly. Ethan glanced back quickly. Me? Walter nodded. Said his younger brother never stopped trying to save people, even after life stopped making it easy. Ethan looked away. Snowstorms of a different kind moved quietly inside memory. Failed jobs. Sleepless nights. Empty motel rooms. Pride swallowed one small piece at a time until survival became the only thing left. Feels like I stopped saving anybody a long time ago, he said quietly. Walter rested one weathered hand lightly against the steel wall. Funny thing about broken seasons, he said. Sometimes they look like endings right before they become something else. Ranger suddenly lifted one paw and touched the keypad lightly. Not random. Intentional. Ethan stared, then noticed something he had missed before. Scratched faintly into the metal beneath years of dust sat 4 numbers carved carefully into the corner. 12/21. Ethan blinked hard. December 21st. Nathan's birthday. Slowly, almost afraid to trust it, Ethan pressed the numbers into the keypad. 1, 2, 2, 1. Silence followed. Then came a low mechanical sound beneath the floor. Old gears waking carefully after years asleep. Somewhere inside the steel door, locks shifted one after another with deep metallic clicks that echoed softly through the underground room. Walter inhaled sharply beside him. Well, he murmured quietly. Looks like the mountain finally answered. The steel door opened only a few inches before stopping. Cold air spilled out carrying something unexpected. Pine smoke, leather, and cedar. Familiar somehow. Ethan pulled harder. Slowly, the door opened wider into a smaller room hidden beyond. Ranger stepped forward immediately. No hesitation. No fear. Lantern light revealed shelves lined with journals, maps, survival gear, and framed photographs arranged carefully across the walls. But what stopped Ethan completely sat in the center of the room. A wooden table. And resting on it beneath a pool of warm light stood a sealed metal box beside a single envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. To Ethan. If Ranger found you, IT means you are ready. For a moment, nobody moved. The room felt suspended between memory and something larger than memory, as though time itself had been waiting quietly beneath the mountain for this exact moment to arrive. Ethan stood frozen near the doorway, the letter resting beneath warm overhead light like something fragile enough to break if touched too quickly. Ranger walked forward first. The shepherd moved calmly across the room and stopped beside the wooden table. Then, with the kind of quiet certainty that no training could fully explain, he sat beside the envelope and looked directly at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan swallowed slowly. His throat felt unexpectedly tight. 8 years of silence had prepared him for grief. Anger. Questions with no answers. But not this. Not a letter written directly to him, as though Nathan somehow knew this night would come. Walter remained near the doorway, respectful enough not to interrupt whatever unseen thread had suddenly tightened between brothers separated by time and weather. Go on, the old man said softly after a while. Some things do not like waiting forever. Ethan stepped closer. The handwriting stopped him before he even reached for it. Familiar. Steady. Nathan's sharp block lettering, the kind he always used after years writing field reports and mission logs. To Ethan. If Ranger found you, IT means you are ready. Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. Ranger rested his chin lightly against Ethan's knee, grounding him again, keeping him here. Ethan carefully opened the envelope. Inside sat several folded pages and an old photograph worn softly around the edges. Before reading, his eyes drifted instinctively to the picture. 2 boys standing beside a fishing dock somewhere under summer sunlight. Nathan around 17. Ethan maybe 10. Both grinning beneath crooked baseball caps, while holding fishing poles far too large for them. Their father standing behind them, laughing at something lost to memory now. Ethan stared longer than he meant to. It had been years since he looked at that version of himself. Before military service. Before funerals. Before silence became easier than asking hard questions. Slowly, he unfolded the first page. Nathan's voice rose naturally from the handwriting inside Ethan's mind, clear enough to ache. Little brother, if you are reading this, then first things first. I am sorry for leaving the way I did. I told myself I was protecting people by disappearing, but truth is, I just got tired of pretending I knew how to come home after everything changed. Ethan blinked hard once, but kept reading. Some storms do not end when deployment does. You know that by now. They follow people quietly. Into empty apartments. Grocery stores. Family dinners. Motel rooms that never really feel like shelter. I spent years trying to outrun mine. This mountain taught me something different. Sometimes healing is not escape. Sometimes healing is finally sitting still long enough to hear yourself again. Ethan lowered the page briefly, chest tightening with something dangerously close to grief and relief colliding at the same time. Walter looked away politely toward the shelves while Ranger remained close enough for warmth. Ethan turned to the next page. Dr. Mercer built this place because he believed forgotten people deserved somewhere safe to remember who they were before pain taught them silence. After he passed, Walter and I kept it alive. But age catches everybody eventually. One day someone else would need to continue what started here. If that person is you, it means Ranger trusted you enough to bring you home before life finished convincing you that you had nowhere left to go. Ethan stared quietly at the words. Home. The word felt strange now. Heavy. Like something he had stopped expecting from the world years ago. Then his eyes moved toward the sealed metal box resting beside the letter. One sentence beneath Nathan's signature caught his attention immediately. Open the box only after reading everything. There is one more storm coming. Ethan frowned. Walter shifted slightly behind him. Storm coming? The old man asked softly. Before Ethan could answer, the underground shelter lights flickered once. Then again. Somewhere above, the mountain groaned louder than before. A deep shifting sound rolled through stone and steel. Ranger stood immediately, ears high, body tense. One sharp bark broke the quiet. Walter's face changed instantly, calm replaced by concern. That does not sound right, he said quietly. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost swallowed by wind. A distant metallic alarm echoing softly through the underground shelter from somewhere upstairs. Ethan looked toward Walter immediately. What is that? Walter moved quickly toward the hallway now, slower than fear, but faster than age usually allowed. Emergency weather beacon, he said. Only triggers when someone gets stranded near the ridge. Ranger barked again, already moving toward the corridor. Ethan folded Nathan's letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the storm had not finished speaking yet, and somewhere beyond the snow, somebody else might already be losing their fight against the cold. Ranger reached the stairwell before anyone else. The shepherd moved with focused urgency, nails tapping softly against steel as he climbed toward the cabin above, while the emergency beacon echoed faintly through the underground shelter. Ethan followed close behind, one hand gripping the rail, while Nathan's letter rested safely inside his jacket, like something warm enough to survive storms. Walter moved slower but steady behind them, lantern swaying softly against the concrete walls. Above ground, wind had returned stronger than before. The cabin trembled gently beneath heavy snow pressing against the roof, while the emergency radio near the fireplace blinked with sharp red light. Ethan crossed the room quickly and picked up the receiver. Static crackled first. Then a weak voice broke through the noise. Female. Shaking. Exhausted. If anyone hears this, the voice whispered unevenly. Truck slid near marker 12. Heater stopped working. My father cannot walk. Please. The signal dissolved into static again. Ethan looked toward Walter immediately. How far? Walter stepped closer to an old wall map hanging near the fireplace. About 4 miles northeast, he said quietly. Road turns dangerous there. Cliffs on one side. Ranger barked once near the door. Ready already. Ethan glanced outside where snow rolled through darkness like waves across the mountain. Another version of himself might have hesitated. Homeless. Tired. Broken down by years of disappointment. But something inside him had shifted underground. Maybe Nathan had known it would. Maybe storms only revealed parts of people they forgot still existed. Ethan grabbed a winter pack from the supply shelf near the door. I am going, he said simply. Walter looked at him carefully. Road will be rough. Ethan zipped his coat higher and clipped a flashlight to his jacket. People still need help, he replied quietly. Guess some things never really leave you. Walter nodded once, something proud settling softly into his tired expression. Then take the emergency sled, he said. Nathan rebuilt it himself. 40 minutes later, mountain wind clawed hard against Ethan's face as he and Ranger moved through chest-deep snow beneath a sky swallowed entirely by storm clouds. The sled cut narrow tracks behind them carrying blankets, medical supplies, and emergency heat packs. Ranger stayed slightly ahead, ears raised against the wind, nose working constantly through drifting snow. Every few minutes he paused, listening toward sounds Ethan could not yet hear. Marker 12 appeared, almost hidden beneath ice. A bent road sign barely visible beside broken pines. Then Ranger barked sharply and bolted toward a shallow embankment. Ethan followed fast. Below, half buried in snow, sat an old pickup truck tilted awkwardly near the edge of the road. Dim hazard lights blinked weakly through frost. Ranger circled once, then stopped near the driver's side door. Inside sat an older man wrapped in blankets beside a woman no older than her mid-30s trying desperately to keep warmth inside the cab. Relief crossed her face immediately when she saw Ethan through the storm. Oh, thank God, she breathed as Ethan opened the door carefully. Radio finally worked. The older man looked pale but conscious, wrapped in layers against the cold. Ethan checked quickly. Exhaustion. Mild hypothermia. Nothing worse yet. You are going to be all right, Ethan said calmly. We have shelter nearby. The woman blinked through tears gathering from relief more than fear. Nobody comes up here during storms, she said softly. Ethan looked briefly toward Ranger standing guard near the truck, snow collecting gently across his fur. Somebody always should, he answered quietly. The return trip took longer. Slow. Careful. Ethan pulling the rescue sled while Ranger stayed near the older man, checking constantly, as though protecting strangers had always been part of his understanding of the world. By the time cabin lights appeared through the snow, dawn had begun softening the horizon into pale silver. Walter stood waiting on the porch holding 2 lanterns, looking relieved enough not to hide it. Warmth filled the cabin quickly after that. Soup simmered near the fire. Blankets wrapped around tired shoulders. The woman introduced herself as Claire Morgan, schoolteacher from a nearby town. Her father, Henry, rested quietly near the fireplace while Ranger lay nearby as though guarding peace itself. Morning arrived slowly over the mountain. Snow settled into silence. Light stretched gently across the frozen ridges beyond the windows, soft and forgiving in the way winter sometimes became after surviving its worst moods. Ethan stood alone near the underground room later that afternoon, finally opening the sealed metal box Nathan left behind. Inside rested documents, property papers, trust agreements, maintenance plans. One final letter. Nathan's handwriting steadier this time. If you are reading this, then the mountain chose correctly. Walter cannot keep this place forever. Neither could I. So now it belongs to you. Not as property, as purpose. Keep the doors open for people who forgot they matter. Let the storms bring them here if they have nowhere else left to go. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Outside, Ranger rested near the porch watching snow drift gently from pine branches into sunlight. Walter stood nearby quietly repairing an old lantern while Claire laughed softly with her father inside for the first time all day. Something shifted inside Ethan then. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet enough to feel real. Like frozen ground remembering spring still existed somewhere beneath it. Weeks later, a new sign stood near the mountain road where travelers could finally see it through the snow. North Ridge Veteran Shelter. Warm food. Safe place. All are welcome. And every evening, just before sunset, Ranger sat near the porch watching the mountain trails as though listening for whoever needed help next. Because sometimes miracles do not arrive all at once. Sometimes they arrive slowly, wearing snow on their shoulders, carrying old grief in one hand and hope in the other, until one quiet storm finally leads them home.